Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Vince, and I've been doing admissions since 1989 and college counseling since 1998 in California.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince and I will discuss any changes we noticed in admissions decisions this year. It's a 1-hour discussion, so you'll hear part 1 of 3 today. Susan and I answer a question from an anonymous listener who actually has several questions about how to select an engineering program. It's part 2 of 3, my debate with David Blobaum, the co-founder of Summit Prep and a national spokesperson on the value of standardized test scores. We debate whether selective universities should make the ACT and or the SAT mandatory. And Jim Bach, the vice president and dean of admissions at Swarthmore College, took almost 75 minutes of his time to help us to understand Swarthmore College. So this is part 2 of 3 of that interview. And as soon as you hear this, I'm off to tour Baylor University in Waco, Texas.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Vince, my friend, it's been a few months. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for asking. I think last time we talked, it was hip time.
It was hip time. And our listeners have been asking how'd the hip surgery go?
I have a new hip. And I have to say, if anyone is hesitating, and I will, shout out to Dr. Yun here in LA. He's, is fantastic. Like, I didn't realize how much stress and strain it was causing until the pain immediately. We're talking, there's, it's after you have a surgery, there's still some pain, but almost immediately, as soon as the epidural goes away, you're like, wow, it's gone. Like there's nothing to think about on that side of your body. And the recovery has been excellent.
Has it been 2.5 months? How long has it been since we talked?
So it was the 18th. Was that a Monday or the 20th?
18th of January?
January, yeah.
Okay. All right. So a little more than 2 months. And do you have how does it impact you now? Like, how does it, less pain, obviously, but are there certain things you can't do? I mean, I don't know anything about it.
Well, I will say they do have strict rules about, don't put any sort of creams or salves on the scar. They want it to heal naturally. Right. You can't really get into like a jacuzzi or a sauna for a month, but sure. that's gone.
But after that, you can?
Yeah. Once I had my month after visit with the doctor,
mm-hmm.
They were really impressed by the range that I had gotten back, and there hasn't been any repercussions. It's been
so. I know you're a treadmill guy. Are you able to do the treadmill again?
It's so funny. Okay. So there's 2 things. Treadmill, you got to wait 6 months.
Okay.
So now I'm doing a bike. So I do a bike, and that's working out great. And you cannot do lower body weightlifting with weights.
Yeah.
That's it for 6 months.
Well, I'm so happy it's gone well, and thank you for being willing to share your own personal story a little there with our listeners too.
Thank you.
So Vince and I have a lot of exciting things to talk to you about, but our listeners always like it when we just kind of share some things we're observing out there. I'm not going to share mine right now because you guys hear from me all the time, but I want to just hear from Vince, and I want to see anything you're observing. We're still waiting. Vince and I are recording this on the 20th of March. And so I know Berkeley and UCLA are not out, but all the rest of the UCs are out.
Yes.
I know you always have a lot of UC clients. What are you observing there? It's sometimes hard for me to, for me, it feels like UCI, UCSD, and UCSB, those three schools, they're different schools, but their selectivity feels very similar to me, just depending on one kid gets in one and not the other. I know sometimes it's major. Do you feel that with those three schools? They all feel very similar to you in selectivity?
They're very close, and you'll see what, different applicants or with your clients, you will see like, waitlist at Irvine doesn't mean that you won't get in at San Diego and Santa Barbara and vice versa. I mean, it
Yes.
really is up and down. And I think that the students who are close, that's where you'll see the most sort of difference in admissions. I will still say that I do feel like Santa Barbara came back to earth, after last year and waitlisting 15,000 and admitting 8,000 from the wait list. They had to probably took a hard look about how selective they were going out. And to me, they reversed that trend. And I felt like they were taking students. I have more students in with Santa Barbara came up Monday. I have more students who are interested in going than the year before. And that's because they were choosing students where that's within their bandwidth. And students they might have the year before let go of, completely denied, they waitlisted, which I thought was really appropriate because they were close, probably. I felt like San Diego was more generous than last year, which surprised me. But I would still say, I don't know, STEM major. Wow, if you put down something in STEM, especially at Irvine, it's risky. You're taking, you have
You feel it's riskier at Irvine than at San Diego for
yes,
some?
yes, and Santa Barbara.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think that is something that we continue, sort of to look at. The other thing that I wanted to put out to the readers, because this is something they may not have heard before, but I had a student who had some
Hey, Vince, I can tell you're a little rusty because these are listeners, not readers.
oh
just had to bust your chops on that one.
readers. Wow, I don't know what I was thinking. Uh, Listeners, they may not have heard this one recently. So I had a student who, had some serious issues regarding their applying to school. So if they, when they were saying, have you been suspended? Have you?
Yeah. That stuff we know.
So fortunately, I didn't hear about it until they became client. Not that I would have said no, but I would have liked to have known before
Sure.
taking it on. But I felt like with the student who is really, I have to say, remarkable at looking at taking an obstacle, being honest about what their mistakes were, being forthright with the colleges. And I will say that not all the colleges bought it. There were some, places. She was This particular individual was extraordinary, extracurricularly and academically. There was some real strengths, but with the discipline stuff in there, I just didn't know how it would land. And I think when the school is on board, when the student is on board and honest about what happened and what they did, it has to do with it had to do with AI and just sort of the newness of that. And it was an issue that occurred more than once, so that was also something I was concerned about. But I think that they ended up at really good places, and I was pleased to see that. I felt like the schools who nodded yes really understood what had happened, and one school, which I was like, wow, I didn't know that happened. They actually had a meeting about it from admissions. Like they had somebody call and say, this is what our policy is. This is what would happen if that occurred here. And they went ahead and said yes. But I was really pleased by the response that she got, and even where it was a no, there was some encouragement to maybe reapply after the first year if things were going well.
That's was one of the biggest things I learned in my time working with Susan at Westtown, 2002 to 2009. There's, especially in a boarding school environment, right? Because everything kind of comes out. So you're going to have incidents with alcohol and people are going to get caught. You're going to have people using, substances they shouldn't use. You're going to have different things, whether it was stealing or other things. And I was quite pleased at how many times kids still got into very selective schools as long as they really showed complete contrition, didn't make excuses, and talked about the lessons that they learned from the experience. Because oftentimes I thought, okay, that's great, but in more competitive circles, I'm looking at someone who doesn't have these risk factors. It's like, I may believe you and your story, but it's not really a matter of there's finite spaces. And so taking the person over the other person, obviously it's not that simple as that, because there's so many different aspects of what makes up an applicant, and there's so many things that make up what the institutional needs are. But yeah, I mean, I think schools in general show a lot of grace. They have the understanding like kids are going to mess up. And if you learn the lessons in high school, if they really believe you and they think you are likely not to repeat that same thing here, like you said, it's a mixed bag. It doesn't always work. When it doesn't work, we're not around the committee. We don't know all the factors that led to it not be, it could have been something in the academic evaluation that wasn't as competitive. Unless we're literally around the committee or in the reading room, we don't exactly know. We can do our best to judge based on our experience, but yeah. Now, you have a fair amount of experience with UW, don't you? A lot of West Coast applicants look at UW.
Yes.
'Cause I heard from some Seattle counselors that it was surprisingly difficult up there this year. In-state was surprisingly difficult. Had a smaller sample size this year. The kids I applied did well, but they were strong, so it's hard for me to get a read on it. Any observations for you with that school?
I felt like their admissions to me, they're sort of tied to that UCI, UC San Diego, UC Santa Barbara. Maybe not quite Santa Barbara yet, but close. The one I would say that everyone I expected to be admitted was admitted.
Mm-hmm.
The only sort of challenge that I saw there was when they're applying to engineering.
Yeah, well, yeah, engineering comp sci.
Yeah.
But I know business can be tough there, like even some other majors. Not at that same level, but yeah. What about any observations from other schools, East Coast schools, Midwest schools? Anything jump out to you as either more or less selective? Like I can throw one out there for you that I noticed. I noticed Virginia Tech got harder this year.
Wow.
I had couple students, in-state students, that got in Florida but didn't get in Virginia Tech. And, Florida only takes 10% out of state. It's fairly selective. When I was there, which wasn't that long ago, September 9th, they told me they already had 7,000 more applications than all of last year.
Wow.
So I shouldn't be surprised by that. But I had a couple kids who I would have probably put their chances at Virginia Tech at like 75 or 80% that didn't get in. I don't know. That's one that's I've noticed on that side. I don't know. Anything at all, observations, from places where you had a healthy amount of applicants?
With Virginia Tech, do you think that was STEM related or their major?
Like one was aerospace, which I know is tough.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was in like a real competitive major too. So I know this school admits by major. They're like a Cal Poly. They have a separate admit rate for every single major.
Yeah.
They make it very clear you're not competing with, if you're in engineering, chemical's not competing with biomedical. Biomedical is competing with biomedical.
Yeah.
And I know aerospace is tough, but like this, a kid that got in Purdue, out of state, Florida, a lot of other schools, you might have thought you'd get in your in-state institution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the three biggest surprises that I saw this year, I felt like UTA was more generous in admission. I did not expect that to happen.
Now, you say UTA in Texas UTA is Arlington. Are you talking
Oh,
about? You talking? I know that because I made the mistake on the podcast once, and a really astute Texas listener said, UTA is Wellington, right? You were talking about Austin. I had a surprising kid get in there too, but the thing is, that's another school that's so major oriented. An out of state kid that surprised me that they got in there.
yeah. And I do feel at Austin, yes, you're correct. That I felt like their communications, their media school really does control the process, because a couple of kids that I saw admitted, it was clearly based on talent and not the overall, like, where they were following in their school. I was really excited for that particular individual because they didn't see that anywhere. They didn't see it anywhere else. Although they also got into Washington, and then they pulled their UCs because they wanted to make sure they were able to leave the state. And then the other two places that I felt like were much more open this year than I have experienced in the last probably 3 years was UNC and UVA.
Those are tough.
They're so tough for out of state that I don't even hold my breath. Like, I almost forget that we applied there, because if it happens, you're like, oh, great. But this year it happened more, and not that the students who didn't get the nod don't deserve it, but I just had equally strong, compelling people in years past that just deny. So that was a pleasant surprise. So a little bit more openness.
Vince, I definitely saw this year with UNC. We had more out of state admits to UNC than I think we've ever had, and it's because they expanded their class and took 500 more kids. The good news is this: they're adding 500 more kids a year for the next 10 years. So I expect this trend of UNC getting easier to get in to continue. Of course, perhaps as word gets out, they may get a lot more applications, so that may nullify each other. So we'll see. Now, I didn't notice UVA getting easier. In fact, I noticed it was a lot harder from Northern Virginia this year.
And then we talked about this last year, but I think it's going to continue and grow even more. All these options you're admitted, but we'll send you to, London or
Sure.
Rome.
Yeah, those are on the rise. People are trying to copy the Northeastern model.
And one big surprise, this is for your transfer listeners, Wisconsin, maybe it's just because I didn't notice, but I felt like they had a priority deadline and then the regular deadline. And the priority was like matches Michigan. and I love Wisconsin. Please don't get me wrong. But that's early. That's like the first app, transfer app due in the country. I don't know if you want that to be your priority deadline, but March 1st came, which is the regular.
Friends, Vince and I are recording this on March 20th, but I've seen quite a few changes since then. So I'm going to add some commentary here on April 16th that I didn't necessarily know on March 20th. I'm glad Vince brought up Wisconsin because I had a very interesting experience with Wisconsin this year. I saw ridiculously strong kids, out-of-state kids. I'm talking about kids who had the numbers, the metrics, high 1500s, 4.0s, or high 3.9s, great writing, great recs, decent extracurriculars, though I would say that varied from student to student. But very interesting kids, the kind of kids I thought Wisconsin would find compelling, and the kind of kids in the past, in the early round, they did find compelling, but those kids were getting deferred. We saw this 4 different times with 4 different kids from 4 different parts of the country. And like I said, I was used to Wisconsin taking those kids, so I was quite flummoxed. But you know what? All 4 of those kids were admitted in the regular round. And I have a theory. So this was the first year they launched their new 5% auto admit if you're a Wisconsin resident. And they have no past history at all. So they have no idea what their yield was going to be. And of course, every college is concerned with under-enrolling, but also over-enrolling because you got to house the kids. So I believe they went out very conservatively in the early round with their admits. And then later, when they realized they had space, they admitted all of those kids. And this is something that I've seen quite a bit over the years, that when a school makes a change in how they're admitting students, They haven't completely built out a yield model yet to account for that change. I mean, how could you? The program is brand new. So you go out extremely conservatively with your acceptances in the early round until you can see the entire pool. And then you can admit those early deferrals. Do you work with many transfers, Vince? Do you work with many transfers? Because I only have, every year I have one or two, maybe three. Three's like a lot for me. I usually have one or two transfers.
It's increasing, I think. Maybe it's because I talk so much about it on the podcast. But that date passed, that March 1st, and Wisconsin started calling kids that had applied in the past. So I had a student at BU who got a call, and I was like, you better check because the deadline passed like 3 weeks ago. And he said, I called and they said, submit it.
A couple of questions for you. One is, do you know if USC has any sort of special commitment to the backyard? Because I noticed that my kids from greater LA get in USC at a higher rate than other places. And they don't, I don't know, some of this may be familiarity breeds contempt, but they oftentimes don't regard it as that big of an accomplishment. And it's like, I'm trying to tell them, like, I had kids, and kids that didn't get in USC that got in every selective school you can think of in the country. And they don't get in USC. Like, that happens every year. So we get in the most selective schools in the country and they don't get in USC. But it seems like if you're talking about kids from anywhere from Thousand Oaks, down to Orange County. I mean, there's two types. There's some people from USC is to die for, and everything's all about USC. There's that group.
Yeah.
That group is definitely there.
Yeah.
USC is the school. And if they had ED, they would be absolutely EDing. There's definitely that group. But then there's another group that's kind of like, it's USC. Like a lot of people get in. Is that kind of your experience?
I do feel, so I think it depends on which schools you're talking about. I do think that USC does have a commitment to certain schools, public high schools, where they take a large number of kids, La Cañada, Calabasas, Agora, Arcadia High School. And then they have these amazing programs that support the neighborhood kids, like the ones directly surrounding USC. I love the programs, and they take a lot of kids from who live like right there and they could walk to school. I feel like sometimes, depending on the independent school, that they're harder on some independent schools than others. But the value in independent schools in LA is still really high. Like if you are applying from independent school, they're easily going to have at least anywhere from 40 to 60% of the senior class will apply to USC.
That's insane. That's insane. Friends, this concludes part one of the three-part discussion Vince and I had on this topic. Hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3 as we continue to discuss admissions decisions for the class of 2025.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Hi, Susan.
Hey, good morning, Mark. How are you?
Good. It feels like it's been a bit since we've done a question from a listener, so it's something we always enjoy doing together.
I really, really enjoy it. I think this is really where college counseling lies, where we do our best work.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So today we have a question from an anonymous listener. It has to do with engineering programs. Play the question and get your comments.
Hello, YCBK, and thank you for all you do to share your wealth of knowledge about the college application and admission process. You've been such an amazing resource for our family as we start to navigate this next step on our kids' journeys. I have a question about professional accreditation. My youngest is interested in pursuing engineering, specifically mechanical or structural engineering. I have read online about the importance of choosing a program that is ABET certified. ABET stands for the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology. Beyond holding this certification, how should various engineering programs be compared? Certainly programs that use applied learning, hands-on application, and internships stand out versus straight book learning or in class. Does prestige or higher ranking matter when entering the engineering profession, as long as the program itself is certified? And in a broader question, are there other degree programs and professions where seeking a specific outside accreditation is important when evaluating options? Thank you for all your wisdom and guidance.
Susan, I think you're a great person to answer this. I know you've had the opportunity to be involved in admissions at schools that have strong engineering programs and have worked with so many students over the years that have pursued engineering. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is a good kind of in the weeds question. It shows that this parent is, kind of looking carefully. I mean, in a way, what I want any family to do is kind of draw the map between the questions about the university and the learning style and kind of academic style of their son or daughter. Because yes, it's important for professional fields of study. When I say that, Mark, you know what I mean. When there's a difference between graduating from an accredited college or university, which of course is fundamentally important, and then having a accredited degree program, an accredited degree, which usually implies some form of certification or licensure that to someone hiring means that student is ready for a particular level of responsibility once they're employed. So when we say professional fields of study, I think of engineering, architecture,
Nursing,
education.
Mm-hmm.
There are probably more out there, but
Mm-hmm.
business is kind of the half and half area of study. I thought a lot about that as I was listening to this question a couple of times, because the question about what are other accreditations that are important to keep in mind. And most of these academic programs, these professional fields of study, exist both at universities and at liberal arts colleges. You're going to find them less frequently at liberal arts colleges, but even, engineering as a good example, there are some traditional 4-year liberal arts colleges that offer engineering programs. You and I know what they are: Union, Swarthmore. There are a number of them. And then there are a number of kind of small undergraduate focused engineering schools like Harvey Mudd and Rose-Hulman and even WPI, where there's a very, very strong focus on undergraduate STEM education, including education.
Clarkson in there too?
Oh, Clarkson, of course. How could I forget that? I went to college only 10 miles away on the Canadian border in upstate New York. If you like cold weather, head to Clarkson or St. Lawrence. And people used to laugh at me, Mark, because I moved to Maine after I graduated from college in upstate New York, and the Maine climate was nowhere near as cold as upstate New York. There was no comparison, but I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. But Clarkson is one of those great, often overlooked, small undergraduate focused STEM colleges where the faculty are completely devoted to the success of undergrads. So anyway, when you think about ABET accreditation on the engineering level, I think it is important. It means that the university or the college has certain resources. They have a certain standard of faculty education. The faculty have earned certain degrees. So, I don't think you're going to find very many non-accredited engineering programs unless they're called something else. So sometimes you'll run across a program called engineering technology. And if you look at the Rochester Institute of Technology curriculum, and this is actually my next and probably most important piece of advice for our parent, is you've got to go to the website to the department curriculum description, because that's where you're going to find out the difference between academic programs. And some of them, may appeal differently. Wentworth Institute of Technology's engineering degree program is potentially going to look different from Purdue's engineering program. Some have much higher levels of specialization, and some have much more of as our parent mentioned, much more of a hands-on project-based learning approach. So as we think about this crazy diversity of the way engineering programs, and I would say the same about business, are delivered, I think the place to go is to the student's learning style and how do they best learn and what are the priorities for their education. If they're looking for a lot of collaborative team building, project work, close work with faculty and with their classmates, they're going to look for a different style of program. RIT is a great example of a college that has so many different undergraduate engineering programs. And when you look at the title, but then go to the description and the 4-year course program, that's where you're going to find out the difference between, say, the engineering technologies and the engineering programs that are highly specialized, civil, mechanical, biomedical, aerospace, versus ones that are more general degree programs and give the student a very wide introduction before asking them to specialize in an engineering discipline.
That's an important point, Susan, because I've had people tell me Swarthmore is too general. I've had people tell me Smith is too general, when they've been looking at that, if they've wanted something more specific.
Yeah, you also get to take a lot more liberal arts courses.
Sure.
And the opportunity to double major at those liberal arts programs vastly exceeds that of the larger comprehensive universities. So they have their special attributes, but yes, they are different.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. One thing that I like students to look at, and there's quite a few places that have this on the internet, but the one I use the most is the College Navigator website, which is a government-funded website. You can look up any college, just go to National Center of Educational Statistics, NCES College Navigator, put the name of the school in, and then go to the Programs tab. And one of the things it will tell you, it's about a year behind, but it'll tell you how many degrees were issued in each of the different engineering branches. And then you can also see if they have master's and PhD programs. Now, if you're wanting that smaller liberal arts experience, you can't expect necessarily to have like PhDs in engineering. But a lot of times I find people know they want engineering, but they're not necessarily sure what type.
Right.
And having robust offerings can be very appealing to someone who thinks, well, what if I don't, what if I decide I don't like mechanical or electrical or whatever it is. And going on there and seeing the amount of degrees that are offered oftentimes is an indication of quality. Oftentimes, and as well as seeing who has more advanced degrees, because there are resources that are being there. People are selecting and choosing that program. I mean, you can even do this in general. I'll do this with students outside of engineering. Like I'll take them to American or GW, and I'll show them there's nobody in the country offering 300 master's degrees in international relations. Like,
wow,
look at the breadth of this program. Nobody else has that. Because, a lot of times those are names that people that are somewhat familiar with, this field will know, but it doesn't sort of have the cachet of a Georgetown. But when they see that, they'll be like, well, you and I know, those are just almost as good as it gets if you want to be in that field, political science.
That's right.
Right. And so, but it is it is a pretty good indication. That's what College Transition uses in all of their stuff. They look at data, percentage of people getting the degree within the resources of the institution who has advanced. It's not the only thing, because you need to couple that with going to looking at faculty backgrounds, department website, curriculum, experiential opportunities. All of that is part of research. I know we've said this a lot on the podcast, but boy, Susan, and I know that professors don't like this, because I had one tell me this once. I was talking to a Georgia State professor. What I'm going to talk about is Rate My Professors.
Oh, right.
I really like that website because literally my kids picked their classes off of it, and there was not a single time either one of them felt it was inaccurate.
Wow.
But I when I was a kid, I used to work beside someone who was also a professor at Georgia State, and I'll never forget her saying, "So I give a snotty nosed kid a C, and they blast me on the
Yeah, that's right.
so like
It's like Yelp.
yeah, right. So like I get that, but I go back and I look and I'm like, but it literally my kids never. The one time when Joy ignored it because she wanted her Fridays off and she took the person with the low reviews, she paid a heavy price.
Oh, no.
So yeah, so that's when I have a lot of my students do is like, hey, take a look at all the faculty in the department and then go read what students have to say. I find students are really honest, because they have a score in there, whether you're engaging as a communicator, amount of work, how hard you grade, and then comments. Like anything with reviews, I'm going to feel a lot better if there's 10 or 20 or more.
Right. You have to be careful of that.
Yeah, you got to be careful of being skewed by just a couple of them. But I literally was just the other day helping a student select their Coursera course, and they were going in there and reading the reviews on Rate My Professors from the different, because Coursera will give you a lot of options. You go on there and you a little bit choice overload, like, gee, look at all these choices. And then they hadn't seen that website, they were plugging it in and they were reading about all the professors. It's fascinating. So there's a lot of angles that a person can use to do research. What are your thoughts about her question, what role does prestige play in engineering? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, personally, I think the style of the program is so much more than a ranking. I think, we're very quick to go to the website and look at, U.S. News rankings for, mechanical engineering or British history or whatever it is. And it's like, what the heck? Yeah. It's really about what's the environment in which the student is going to be successful. Are they okay if a professor never acknowledges them by name or has office hours where you can go in and actually talk to them? Or are they really going to thrive more if the professor is in, the robotics lab with them and their team and working toward, a particular goal? I mean, I think it's all about student success. Overall prestige, and you've talked at length about this recently on the podcast, Mark. I think those episodes have been really helpful. We don't overlook it. Prestige often means not regional, truthfully, because, you can have a superb regional institution or program that doesn't draw students from much outside of their 100-mile radius. And the delivery of that program can be better than a big national university where kids flock from all over the world, but it's not a good style. It doesn't bring out your best as a student. One thing about engineering, though, that I do like is the first-year engineering programs. Mm-hmm. And I think what you said earlier, that kids don't often know the difference between the engineering specialties. Mm-hmm. Maybe they know what aerospace is and they've had a summer program at NASA or, whatever that, but, the difference between, civil, structural, mechanical, until you're in the weeds working in the classroom and doing some hands-on work, what do you know about, are you interested in bioengineering or chemical engineering or biochemistry that's not even in the engineering department? And I love the first year programs. Purdue's a great example where, you get through an entire 2 semesters of coursework before you then declare your engineering specialization. They may ask you on the application what interests you, but you're not being directly admitted. You're not being put into a slot necessarily. Now, at some colleges and universities, you are. Where I read applications, which is a one of those, kind of top 20 highly accredited engineering programs, it's very important what engineering specialty you're interested in, because it's not a large supersized university. We'll read knowing that we have 15 spaces in biomedical. Now, those fine decisions are made at another level of admissions after a student has gone through the first rounds of elimination. But once they are a true viable candidate and the university would like to admit them, then that's where first choice, second choice engineering discipline. And it's where the student really better know what they're talking about. If suddenly you're going out on a limb and saying biomedical engineering or one of the very specialized, high demand, not high demand, but programs that require a lot of investment on the part of the university, where they simply don't have a lot of spaces, then you better know what you're talking about. And in your application, when you're asked the question about why you're interested in that field of study at that university, you've got to defend your choice. So for a student whose engineering interests are broad, they aren't yet very specific, it's much better to target a university that has a first year engineering program. FYE is what a lot of the schools call it. And that's very, very easy to find by just looking on a college's website. It's a research question I give to all my kids when I'm helping them build their lists is, first of all, what are you a good fit for? Mm-hmm. What do you want? And then what do these universities have? And it requires a deep dive on the website.
Yeah,
don't go to third parties for that.
Yeah, we can't shut out those department websites enough.
That's right.
They're utilized. And I think particularly, I really wish all schools did it first year. I don't know how you can expect somebody to know this. That's one thing I can't tell you how many students over the years I've talked to that talked about when they were in medical school and they had to do those rotations. That's when they figured out what was for them.
Of course.
Not for them. And I think it's particularly important when a school admits by major that a student knows what is the plan if I don't like this and I want to switch somewhere else.
That's right.
You're the Virginia Techs, the UT Austins, the Cal Polys. You really need to know that because they have very, very different policies about what internal transferring is like. And I just think from my experience, and I think statistics back this up, it is almost the norm, more so than the exception, that people are going to switch. More people switch than don't switch. There's certainly people that knew at age 6 or 7 what they wanted to do and they stay on that course.
Yeah.
But that is most people at what they think they want to do at 18. How can you possibly know, right? It requires knowing yourself extremely well, knowing all the different options that are
right.
And who knows all that for busy high schoolers that are busy with all the other things in their life. Some people do, but most don't.
Well, who does, Mark, are the kids coming up through the STEM high schools.
Yeah.
Or through high schools that have STEM certificate programs.
They get a lot of exposure. They get so much exposure.
Yeah. But that's not a lot of kids.
Yeah.
We know, and that's really a phenomenon only in the last couple decades, where high schools
like they're springing up though. Some of these charter special STEM schools.
That's right. But even then, they may not, depending on whether they're super well resourced or not, they may not be giving kids as broad. Like, I'm working with a transfer student this year who's in a very good, highly rated engineering program at a selective university, high on the prestige meter, but who has in engineering realized that he wants nuclear engineering. So I suddenly became an expert in nuclear engineering, right?
That's funny how we have to do that sometimes.
Oh my gosh. Well, I didn't, I knew what it was and I associated it more with a graduate level field of study, but some students within, mechanical or chemical engineering, this is the direction they want to go. My inclination is always to say to those kids is get your master's in it, get the broad foundation, you may by senior year have more doors open to you than you will if you overfocus in a way. Both things can work for kids, but more often than not, the broader the undergraduate program, the better, because also we know how quickly things are changing right now in the universe. But so in our research for these programs, he discovered, first of all, that there are very few undergraduate programs, and they have like single digit spaces in them. And despite being a superlative student with a lot of resume bells and whistles, he is not getting into them. So there's a good example. And, you kind of, you make hay while the sun shines. You got to make the most of the university program that you have. And luckily, that's what he's doing, is he's found a professor who has a chemical engineering professor who has a lot of interest in nuclear, and they're going to be working together on kind of an enrichment program for him. So there's an example where, yeah. And it's funny, Mark, what he said to me is, I don't want to transfer down. Right. So he's at big name school. And when I said, well, the nuclear engineering undergraduate programs are virtually all at public universities, because that's where the funding is. It may not be there in the future, given what's going on politically, but right now. And he's like, well, I don't want to transfer down. And I'm like, well, pick your poison here. If you could go to NC State, if they would take you, which they didn't.
Yeah.
Or you can stay at fancy, expensive.
NC State has some very competitive engineering programs.
And there's the prestige issue of, what does that really mean? What does prestige mean to a family? And, if, a super expensive private university with engineering attached to it feels more prestigious, it may not be in the field of study. So, I think if the accreditation, if the highest level of accreditation is in place and the student pays attention to the type of program that's going to bring out his best, whether that's, WPI and project-based learning, co-op at Drexel or Northeastern or the University of Cincinnati, or liberal arts and sciences at, Swarthmore or Smith or Trinity or Union, that what's best for one student isn't going to be what's, best. The parent did ask about other accreditations. And, truthfully, external accreditations, as I mentioned, are generally in just the professional schools. But yes, it is important for, architecture, public health, theology. Interestingly, I looked that one up, and nursing. So you've got to make sure that your son or daughter is going to be ready to sit for whatever the license exam is. Think about accounting and actuarial science. Your university has to have you ready to begin that journey of licensure exams. So those are the kind of the weedsy, to borrow one of your words, the weedsy questions that parents and kids should be looking at. And interestingly, I found out there are two different levels of business accreditation, because the university where I've been reading has AACSB, which is the more selective programs, and often is associated with graduate business education. But there is a group of undergraduate schools that has the AACSB. A lot of other colleges, less selective ones, have ACBSP. Talk about confusing, which tends to be more focused on accreditation of business education programs and less on schools that offer research as part of their curriculum. So again, accreditation can vary. You got to study up on that.
Yeah, one thing I always tell families, and this came out both in my interview with Chris when I had him on talking about AI, and I asked him any schools that you find do particularly well at preparing people. And he mostly emphasized it's not really about that. It's more about he's hiring more senior level. It's more about the resume and track record that you've had
That's right.
a bit more of an entry level thing. But he did say, hey, I've seen great people come from George Mason and Temple. And
That's right.
and the point I'm making is a lot of times in the employment world, the list of places where they've gotten people that really are well prepared is not exactly, doesn't always align with what the public thinks of as prestigious.
Yeah, that's true.
Like they're in this world every day. They know who prepares people well. I remember a long time ago, I was meeting with a family, and so long ago it was in person. I hardly ever do in-person meetings now, unless people are. I just was excited to find out I got a family from Riverside, California, that's flying in here on Wednesday, and so I meet them when they come through here to check out like Emory and
Sure.
Georgia Tech, Spelman, Morehouse Place, Mercer, places like that. But this is so long ago. Back in 2012. We spent like $50,000 to finish our basement with a conference table and whiteboards and all this stuff, thinking that all these meetings would be in person, and like Zoom changes everything. But this was a long time ago. It was back then. I was meeting with a family, and the mom, she works in the area of like speech pathology, and she's like, boy, does Valdosta State ever have a great program.
Oh, wow.
Now, this is not a school that is prestigious in the state of Georgia. It's a beautiful campus and, public school in South Georgia, but it's not a school that's looked at as prestigious. But here's someone who's on the hiring side saying, she basically said, I just had such great success hiring their graduates.
Another great example that is specifically related to engineering is Kettering University in Michigan, formerly known as GMI. They're doing some absolutely cutting edge things in engineering that no one else is doing, that employers absolutely love. And I recently interviewed the president of Kettering for over an hour and a half. And you're going to want to hear that interview because it's an example of just what Susan was sharing about looking at the uniqueness of the program coupled with the results.
And they're just bringing up the point that a lot of times who employers know to be a very good school, it's a lot broader list. And it doesn't mean that schools that are prestigious are not very good and they're looked upon negatively. Although I did have a conversation last week with someone who was telling me how their law firm has moved away from some of the brand names that they used to hire, and things have changed in the industry. And they find they're not as hungry and teachable. And that's another story for another day. And every firm is different. But I always try to remind people of that. Like, they know this world. Their knowledge is a lot more vast than what Joe Blow on the street knows because he sees a bumper sticker or a T-shirt. Like, they deal with this every day. Because in the employment world, like with a school like NC State is highly, highly reputable in engineering, Virginia Tech as well.
Of course.
But those are not necessarily names that wow people. Unless they're from that area. There's always such a thing as local prestige, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Like Lisa will tell you how hard it is for kids in the Research Triangle to get into NC State. In fact, I was talking with the former Duke admission officer who's now on the counseling side, and he'll say a lot of times NC State's harder for them than Chapel Hill in the Research Triangle. But that's local knowledge. You have local knowledge that's specific to programs, but nationally, the perception, I'm just making the point that nationally the perception can be very different from the employer perspective or the local perspective.
That's right. Absolutely. And that's why, again, go to those websites of the colleges and read about not just the structure of the curriculum, but what alumni are doing, what they're, reach out to professors. And this is something that the kids should be doing, not the parents, but, have a student ask if they can do like just an informational interview with a professor in their area of study and talk about how they support students who are looking to go on in certain, areas of research or, applied engineering or applied science, or, what do you do if you love physics and you've taken 2 years in high school? Is engineering the only thing you can do with that? What if you just really love physics? And, talk to some professors, make an appointment with the career services office. Just start having what are called informational interviews. Everybody knows what that means on the other side. You're not asking them to like you. You're asking for them to help you figure out how to apply to the right fields of study, right? It's a great level of research.
This has been great. And you and I, we could go on another half hour
I know.
easily, but we got some more questions we want to answer today. But thank you so much for sending this question in.
Yes, wonderful. Best wishes.
Yep, thank you. And don't forget to request your book from the Princeton Review. We still have 80-something to give away, and they're happy to send them off to you. And, you have 4 choices. You can get their book on Best 390 Colleges. You can get their book on the new digital SAT. You can get their book on tips for the personal statement, essays that kicked apps. And then they just have an overall general college admissions book. So just reach out and let us know which book we want. We're happy to get it off to you.
And you do that by sending me an email at mark@schoolmatch4u.com.
Thanks, Susan.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 3 of my debate with David Blobaum, co-founder of Summit Prep, I share multiple other reasons why I'm not in favor of mandatory ACT or SAT as a policy. David shares what he thinks about some of the other reasons why I do not favor mandatory test scores. I share my skepticism that the return to test scores is being motivated by desire to admit more underrepresented and under-resourced students. David shares why he believes it was a courageous decision for colleges to return to test scores. I share why the overwhelming majority of admission officers who read files at highly selective schools love test optional admissions, and they are discouraged if their institution returns to an ACT or SAT mandatory policy. Listen and enjoy. So here's a couple other things that I don't like about the test mandatory. One is, and in and of itself, this would only be one factor, but this is one of many. I do think we have a mental health crisis in our country, and I see the amount of anguish and mental stress that people have over these tests because they believe them to be such a high stakes game because of people out here saying, oh, that's the most important thing in the file. So that's one factor. I don't like what I see in terms of how that leads to kids investing in certain things at a young age when I think they could be doing other things. So it's one thing I love about what, I'm seeing out there in California. Like, it's not leading to this obsession with the test. I will talk with 7th and 8th grade students and parents who are obsessed with their test scores. To me, that's not healthy. It's not healthy. It's not good for their own personal development, not just in terms of the mental anguish, but all the other better things they could be doing with their time, whether it's, just pursuing their own creativity or interests. So what are your thoughts on that?
I theoretically like it. So, the tricky thing is that a lot of times, I agree with you, there are better uses of time than studying for the SAT and ACT very often, right? But if students aren't studying for the SAT and ACT, they might just be on TikTok or on Instagram. So are they actually using that time? Would they actually be using that time for something that would be enriching? Maybe, maybe not. So this at least guarantees that they're focusing on knowledge and skill that will help them in college and in life. At least that's the way that I see it. I do think as well that, the data is out that grade inflation is real and that parents have not caught up to that fact. So it's 90% of parents believe that their children are at or above grade level in reading and math, but it's a majority of students who are not at or above reading level in reading and math. And according to the Nation Report Card, the NAEP scores, we're at 20, 30-year lows in academic math and reading achievement among 4th graders and 8th graders. So ironically, because grades are no longer as accurate of signals if you're achieving academically, ironically, I think we actually need to pay more attention to standardized test scores, because those are now sometimes giving the more accurate signal. So I don't want students to be more stressed. It's not something I ever want. I think another way of approaching that would be, I think you do a great job in your podcast, which I said it offline, I'll say it online. I think you have the best podcast on college admissions. I think you do a great job of looking at colleges themselves in context. And I think I'm not obsessed with, the top 20 schools in the way that a lot of other people are. I think that would take a lot of pressure off of kids if they weren't all trying to get into the top 20 schools, for instance.
Yeah, and I just want to say something first of all. First of all, thank you for the kind words about our podcast. That's how we met. David reached out to me as a podcast listener, and well, you've been going on. I think you've had some other appearances where you'd gone on. I guess I don't know if it's a publicist or someone who works for you, reached out to me initially and said, we've got a guy here who makes a lot of guest appearances on the testing topic. Just as an aside, sometimes when you talk out loud, it helps crystallize your thinking a little bit. So one thing that I realize is this fixation, obsession on testing is a big part of my thinking. And I'll tell you why. I know that. I really am comfortable with schools using AP or IB exams as a component in their process, because I don't see 7th and 8th graders obsessing over what they're going to get on AP World. I just don't. Sure, and some stress is part of life. Like, right? I can't just say, oh, it's stressful, you can't do it. Like going for a job interview is stressful. So I'm more comfortable. And also, another thing I want to say is I'm 100% speaking for myself on this topic. We have 9 co-hosts. They have different perspectives on different things. I want to make this really clear. This is not the YCBK view. I'm just completely representing myself. But I do feel it's a combination of these factors. It's the fact that numbers do voodoo on the brain, and they do lead to kids getting passed over who have incredible character traits that not only would serve that college well, but would serve the alumni community well. I look back at some of the students that I worked with 25 years ago who are just crushing it out here. A lot of them were very modest testers. But you look back at it and you think and you remember, do you know what? That kid worked their tail off. They had incredible drive, they had incredible grit, had incredible resilience.
They had great communication skills, great people skills, and they were young men and young women of the highest integrity.
And some of those kids, we debated at length going through the admissions committee because of their test scores. And those are people that could have even easily be passed over. And my fear is that colleges will miss out on kids who will add a lot to their community, by putting this focus on mandatory scores. I also am not confident that schools will be able to take the context of the person's background into consideration enough. So they talk about that. They talk a good game, but it's very easy to just impose a mandatory cutoff or get really uncomfortable with a number without evidence. So what are your thoughts on just my view on numbers do voodoo on the brain? There's something inherently biased about a number. It applies to rankings as well. You see something that says this school's ranked 7th and this school's ranked 27th or 57th. It's kind of ingrained in your mind. That's a better school. Don't know what the formulas were that were used. Don't know if it aligns with what you value. But now it's in your mind. I read this was 7, this was 57. 7's got to be better than 57. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's trade-offs to everything. So I don't see test scores and admissions as an unmitigated good. There are certainly downsides, and some students just don't test well. I've had students who, the difference between their practice test scores and their real test scores is quite dramatic. I've even written recommendation letters for those students, and honestly, they got into great schools, maybe even in part because they had, an SAT tutor who was saying, I love these tests, but these tests got this student wrong, right? So I think on average, they add important context. they're going to get, they're not always going to be, they're not perfectly accurate, and they're not always going to give the correct signals for every student. That's why I think they should just be one piece of the puzzle, right? And if colleges aren't looking at scores contextually, they should be looking at scores contextually. I have more concerns about really the rise of schools using AP exam scores in college admissions, because those are not as available to students. It's a $95 exam, and Caltech just became the first college that I know of that, has said that they require that if you take an AP exam, you submit the score. Or there's schools like Emory. John Ladding said in 2023 that they're not as trusting of high school GPA. And so they're going to be weighing external assessment more heavily than high school grades, particularly leaning on AP exam scores. Well, to me, that's very problematic, because Emory says it's test optional, but they're saying they use external assessment more than high school grades. And then he's not even saying SAT and ACT, which are, objectively more accessible than our AP exam scores. And he's going to use AP exam scores more than high school grades, and presumably more than SAT, ACT scores. So I just see it as there's no perfect way to do it. I would hope, as we would both, that SAT, ACT scores wouldn't be overly weighted in the application process.
David, I don't feel what you said about Emory is fair. They make it very clear that they are SAT or ACT optional, but this does not apply to AP exams. Case Western Reserve and Duke also make this clear. So I don't feel that they are demonstrating some lack of truth in advertising. I think if you listen to them, they're making it crystal clear the distinction between the ACT and the SAT and AP exams. The other thing, David, and we may disagree on this, but I don't know, I haven't talked to you about this. I know that the overwhelming majority of our team does not disagree with what I'm going to say here. Maybe all agree, but I don't want to speak for 100%. So there was a lot of talk that came out from Dartmouth in particular. Brown used some of this language that said that one of the reasons we're going back to mandatory testing is because we believe that it will help us with diversity candidates and under-resourced kids. And the argument that they used was, all things, by the way, these things I'm about to say I would agree with. A lot of times with those kids, they don't have as many other things to work with because, just academically alone, they may not get great teacher recommendations. They may be coming from big schools where they don't know, the kids very well, or they're not descriptive. So they're not getting a lot in the area of recommendations. Sometimes they have limited curriculum. Surprising to know how high a percentage of schools don't even have calculus. People from well-resourced schools would be surprised. And so, and then, MIT has used this argument in the past. It's sort of that diamond in the rough, right? If we don't have curriculum and we don't have much in the way of recommendations, and then the extracurricular is really kind of shoddy what they put on there compared to what you see in families from more privileged backgrounds, you're just not giving me enough to admit you. I definitely agree that you will have less of those factors in those schools. No question about it. But that is the rationale for why they went back. It's really to help the under-resourced kid. I don't believe that. And I don't believe it for a lot of reasons. One, the University of Michigan said the exact opposite. If you saw what they came out and said, they said our research does not show that at all. And I have never seen these schools make major decisions for that population. So I think what's going on there more than anything, and I don't want to stand in judgment, but to a certain extent, I guess I am. In general, because there's a correlation with test scores and income and education. Also, there's a correlation with income and being able to go out and pay for a master test prep tutor and pay crazy dollars for a long period of time. Some very powerful people don't like that they felt like one of the advantages that they had in this process was now taken away. And powerful people who give donations and all of that have a lot of influence. And I just it feels very disingenuous to say we're doing all of this for the under-resourced student. Because to me, if you really cared about that, one, you could go to a do no harm policy, or you could
create something like what I'm talking about. Do the research, figure out the minimum amount of score that you haven't seen success at if somebody doesn't have that score, and then just have a question on your these schools can do what they want. They can have a question on there. They could literally say, you know what? We're going to have a required box. You have to say, did I hit the score? Yes, no, but we don't even want to know what your score is. Now, that's not maybe ideal, but I think it's better than a pure test mandatory system. Now, do I believe Lee Coffin from Dartmouth when he says underrepresented kids were not admitted because we didn't see a test score and there wasn't enough in the file for us to admit them without the score? And when we found out later what their score was, it actually was a score that would have helped them because we read scores in context? I absolutely believe Lee. Julie and I interviewed Lee for 2 hours, and he has too much integrity in my mind to just be making this stuff up. But what I am saying is, if you can use some more creativity, you can get the result you want without introducing all the deleterious impacts of testing that I shared in my debate/discussion. So to me, there's a lot of different ways you could get around that concern other than come out and say, oh, we're doing all of this for the under-resourced kid. What are your thoughts?
So I think the only thing you'd lose there is the ability to hold the kids of the wealthy to a higher standard than the kids of the non-wealthy. So if it's working correctly, then Harvard would want the kids of the top 1% in income to be getting like 34s and 35s, which I think generally they do, to be honest. I mean, I do think that, if you come from privilege, I think they do genuinely, authentically, on average, expect a higher test score from you. And so then if you come, from a very disadvantaged background, you might only need like a 32 to get in. And so to me, I think you would need different cutoffs where, like, if you come from privilege, once you hit like a 34, then you're good, right? But then if you come from a disadvantaged background, once you hit a 30, you're good. Like, because I think that kid with a 30 from a disadvantaged background is probably like, probably smarter than the kid with a 34 from the advantaged background. And so I would hope that the holistic admissions happens as they say that it does. Are they actually doing that? I don't know. I'm not in the committee room.
I mean, here's the thing. And you live in the test prep world. You're in that world. So tests probably seem extremely important. I tell people tests knock you out. They don't get you in at most places. Right. And you talk to almost any admission officer at a highly selective school, and they will tell you, we spend so little time talking about test scores. It's kind of like, look at the score. Okay, that's fine. Move on. Now let's talk about all the other things. Now let's talk about these recommendations and this writing and these personal qualities and this fit to major and all these other components. Like, that's the reality of the conversation. And that's one of the biggest struggles I have with families is when they get the 1570 and to 1600 or 35, 36 ACT, they really think all of a sudden they're getting in because they met averages. And it just produces such a mindset of I would argue, unrealistic expectation. And one of my challenges, and I know why they don't do it, because every once in a while at a conference that we're at, SACAC, NACAC, one of these, you'll have a session where admissions leaders want to hear from counselors about what they could do to help them. And every time I'm at one of those, I say, start producing, especially for the highly selectives, start producing all the kids that had a 1500 that you denied or waitlisted and share that data. Because that's going to help me to not having kids feel like they're getting in because they have these scores. But you know why they don't want to do it? That's going to discourage people and it's going to decrease applications. And at the end of the day, the people you answer to want to see more applications than the year before. So their incentive structure doesn't line up with that. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So, just on the note of applications, I think if you wanted to have your cake and eat it too, you would stay test optional, because we know that colleges get a lot more applications when they're test optional. And Colgate saw 108% increase in its number of applicants when it went test optional.
I mean, they had a bunch of things at the same time there. They expanded, their
their financial aid program significantly. And there was a third thing, three things all happened at once. But we know that test optional was a part of it.
Correct. Yeah. Fair point. The dean of admission says all the stars aligned. So yes.
Correct. Yeah.
So, I think that there's trade-offs on the school end as well. I mean, I think a lot of schools would like to stay test optional to get their applicant numbers up. And then that allows them to reject more students, which drives their admit rate down. And you and I both know from the college end, a lot of parents and students use the admit rate as a proxy for quality. They'll say, oh, well, this school has a 5% admit rate. This school has a 10% admit rate. So obviously the 5% admit rate school is better. And it's like, no, that's just not how it works, right? There are just so many more factors involved. So personally, I think it was actually somewhat courageous for some of these schools to go back to test required. And I mean, I've worked with a lot of students, very wealthy students, who they don't view the test scores as an advantage. They view the test scores as a barrier because, this one family in Dubai, they're literal billionaires, and he started with a 20 on the ACT. He did not get up to that test score of being necessary, right? That would be for those top schools. In your words, it would be he was knocked out based on the test score. He still went up a lot, but that test score was a barrier for him. So I see the test score as a barrier for all students. I see the other loopholes of activities, essays, teacher organizations, athletics. I see the other things as worse offenders, if that makes sense.
So there's a couple of things I want to say. So it's true that the powers that be at the top of the admission office would like more applications because they're the ones that the people they report to like to see that, right? And it's true. It's absolutely true what you said about acceptance rates used as a proxy. I've said on this podcast before, from my experience, people use acceptance rate more than rankings. They're used more than rankings for people to create pecking orders. And I have a really hard time sometimes with great schools with high acceptance rates getting people excited. People certainly on more higher end levels, they want to be able to drop a name and have people impressed that they got into a place that's hard to get in. That is a very common way of thinking with peers and parents. I will never disagree with that. And I also agree that a lot of people use test scores the way you did in 7th grade. That's extremely common. Higher test scores is a proxy for a good school. So I would never disagree with that. But one thing I do want to say, the overwhelming number of admission officers, and I mean overwhelming number of admission officers at the schools that have gone back to required testing, they were not happy about that. Admission officers do not like mandatory testing policies. And the reason for that is because they see super exciting kids from hard to attract populations that they know would add so much to that community, and they now think they're not going to be able to get those kids through. And in their core of their being, they're like, this kid will make our school better, and now it's going to be harder for me to get this kid through the admission process. And that's just a fact. Like I've talked to hundreds of admission officers, and I know their thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I mean, I would hope that they would still accept those exceptional students. I don't want them kept out of those institutions. When I look at it, so I was in favor of test optional before the vast majority of schools went test optional. And in my opinion, they started gaming test optional. And that's when I'm totally fine with test optional for your average college, because your average college accepts vast majority of applicants. I just think I look at it and say, hey, this sounds disingenuous. I mean, University of Southern California, it was Kirk Brennan was recently on a podcast, and he said, yeah, we value SAT and ACT scores. They help us predict who's going to be successful. But then USC on their website, like all those other test optional colleges, they say, you won't be disadvantaged if you don't submit test scores. But then when you look at the actual data, they have almost a 2x higher admit rate for students who submit test scores. Now, again, it's not that simple. Those students might have had
Right,
higher
because
grades.
a lot of times they're collinear, right? A lot of times high test scores and high grades are collinear, so
Yeah.
it's good to decouple the actual advantage. But I think I 100% agree with you that there are schools that are saying they're test optional, and there's a strong preference toward testing.
Right.
That's certainly true out there. The other reason, though, why I have a problem with it is, and I've talked about AP scores here as one thing I'm more comfortable with. I see the flaws in that too. But curriculum is such a revealer. Like, I don't have a problem, for example, at a really rigorous institution and looking at an engineering student and saying, I want to see AP Physics, and I want to see AP Chem, and I want to see good grades and evidence of strong performance in those classes. Like, correct. So to me, the problem with testing is, I agree that this is my overall belief. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, because I think that the little value it adds, if you're really looking at curriculum, and the other thing you can do is you can do profiles of the schools of your feeders and see what type of success record you've had with that. Now, listen, there is a flaw in my argument, and it is, what about the school that doesn't have rigor? What about the school that we don't have a track record with? And I get that. That is a challenging situation. Some schools have attempted to do things. Caltech was creating a program for people that only had pre-calc to come in and get ramped up. I mean, different schools have done different things to try to address that if they've been ambitious in that area. But I think that, because I'm never asking any school to come in and admit kids that can't do the program. But here's something else that I would say. I was having a conversation with one of MIT's competitors. It's a test optional school. Okay. And they had a big problem with MIT requiring testing. And they accept very similar kids, lots of overlap. And they were pointing out, MIT is saying, well, kids without test scores have lower GPAs. And this individual said to me that, for one, how many of those kids are you even admitting with lower scores to even have enough of a sample size? One. But then he said something that I really, really resonated with me. He said, you know what? Our research would show the same thing. Those kids have a 3.2 instead of a 3.4. But look at the value that they add to our community because of the different backgrounds they're coming with. That is so additive. Is it that big of a deal that they have a 0.2 lower GPA? So some of this stuff is coming by putting such a big emphasis on what the grade point average is, or first year grade point average, when I think they should be looking more holistically. Friends, this concludes part 2 of 3 of my debate with David Blobaum. Hope you'll come back for the final part.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, in part 2 of 3 in my interview with Jim Bach, Jim talks about the importance of playing ball with others. What does he mean when he says that? And why is that important? Jim talks about how they target students who meet their needs and not students who they think are going to come when they make admissions decision. Jim talks about whether they build out predictive models to see how kids at certain high schools do when they arrive at Swarthmore from an academic standpoint. Jim talks about how Swarthmore differs from schools like Pomona, Carleton, Amherst, Williams, and Bowdoin. Jim talks about Swarthmore's honors program tutorials that have been around for over 100 years. Jim talks about why Swarthmore is pass-fail for the first semester. I asked Jim to comment on some perceptions I have of Swarthmore, and I asked Jim whether these perceptions are correct. The first one is Swarthmore academically intense? The next one is, are Swarthmore students quirky? The next one is Swarthmore progressive politically? The next one is Swarthmore diverse? The next one is, do Swarthmore students have an insatiable love of learning? And then I ask, is it true Swarthmore students want to change the world? Jim talks about the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility that Swarthmore grad Eugene Lang provided the funding for. And Jim and I talk about how wait lists may change in light of the unforeseen future.
listen and enjoy.
The students who apply, probably many of them have the grades and scores if they submit tests to get in. The question is, do they have these characteristics we're looking for or the needs of the institution? So, Mark, my grades might be, half a point higher than yours or a quarter of a point. I've got a 4.5 GPA and you've got a 4.45. We're essentially even, but mine's higher. My scores may be a little bit higher than yours, but guess what? You play the trumpet and I play the flute, and they need trumpet players this year. We're both qualified. Again, and here's the fair part, but we need trumpet players from Austin who meet whatever need. So a lot of students are admissible, but do they fit the needs of the institution or the characteristics we see? One student may not play well with others, and we're seeing that consistently in recommendations, the way they write their essays, versus the other student who has generosity towards others, has showed sustained commitment, hasn't just joined every club under the sun, but can't tell us why they do any of it. And there's also an analysis piece. We want to see a little bit of analysis in the essays, and oftentimes they are very descriptive. And so you can look equal on paper in terms of your grades and scores, but look very different on the written page. And having that conversation among two people helps move that a little bit more quickly. And also in school groups, you get a sense of what are the needs of our institution, what kind of students do they have. And so that's a real luxury at a selective institution, is to be able to pick and choose among the best and brightest from all schools. But, and here's the good news, potentially, you could take multiple students from that school or none. So it's not about the number that apply, it's about the number who apply, who meet that minimum requirement, but then also add the value that we're seeking through characteristics, either intellectual or social. I hope that makes sense.
No, it's great. It's great. This is awesome stuff. Good stuff. One more question on school groups. So let's say you have a busy school group where you get 20 applicants from the same school compared to maybe a school group that maybe, or not even a school group, really, a school that maybe you get one applicant every 2 or 3 years. Is it fair to say that you may be a little bit more persnickety with the busier school group because you have that luxury?
Persnickety, describe that in terms of our selection or selectivity? Or?
Yeah. That was. I'm glad you asked for that. That's probably a pretty ambiguous word. If it looks like you could yield a lot of school students from a school, and there's not a quota. We know there's not a quota on any school because it's more about the institutional needs, right? And I'm sure there's years. I know when I was at Westtown, there were years Haverford took 6 kids from us out of a class of 100, and I know you have stories like that you could share as well. And we never got quite that many with you, but we had years where you guys took multiple kids from us.
Right.
So there's not a quota, and but at the same time, you want a diversity of feeders when there's so many schools across the country. So is there an aspect of which, this is strong language, I don't want to say apps cannibalize each other, but
right.
that students, when a lot of students are coming from the same school, it sort of ups the bar for who you're going to admit because you can afford to be picky.
Right. No, great question. And this I'm speaking again for Swarthmore here.
Sure.
We're sort of, how do I put this? Going for students we think we may not get, if that makes any sense, that we know where our competition is. So I actually have to admit 965 to yield 425 because of who I compete with. So I'm not technically going based on yield. If I was going on yield, I take the ones I thought that would come. I'm often going after the ones that fit our needs, and then they make their decisions. Right now, about a quarter of them, or say a quarter of the regular decisions, say yes, and 3/3 say no. And so sometimes, we want to always welcome new schools, but it's not by individual. It's just sort of the broad base. Because you're reading so many, again, as I'm just rethinking, literally, we just mailed our decisions this past Friday. I was, I don't know if it was pleasantly surprised. I noticed some groups had multiple, some had none. And again, and as I looked and reread some of them, like, oh, this makes sense. These are not fits, or aren't not so that they're not academic fits, but they're not institutional fits or needs that we have this year. And said, wow, these are really good reads. So, and it's not that schools are better or worse at it. It's the individual that applies. And we do read them individually, but you're right. We see them in the docket there. And again, I would say we're going to go after the ones we think are the best fit, whether or not they're going to yield. So that's sort of on us. And the other thing I'd say, we don't really have feeder schools, and that's due to our size. We're just so small. Even if we admit multiples, we often won't yield multiples because of sort of who we compete with. And so counselors
Mhm.
looked at that and said, wow, not only did you not take anyone, you waitlisted them and they got into XYZ. So we have to work at continuing to encourage counselors to help students find Swarthmore, and then hopefully we'll take them and we'll be on their list to hopefully choose us.
Last question on this topic. Do you do any research on how schools from certain high schools, how kids fare at your school? I know you're small, so you may not, but maybe you do for a place where you have quite a few applicants. Some schools kind of build those models out, right? But they tend to be larger schools where they look at kids that have come in from this school with this profile. That's how it translates to GPA at our school, and that gets partly factored into the reading. Their sense of how students from certain schools have done at their school. Do you guys do any of that stuff?
Very little, and part of it is again, like you said, a function of size, but we are members
Hmm.
of the committee on academic requirements, so there are a handful of students on occasion who struggle here for any number of reasons. And what has been I think particularly eye-opening and confirming is that it crosses race, class, income, score, and often it has to deal with health issues, familial issues, sometimes preparation issues. But if we are seeing over time that it's a range of students coming from a particular high school or location, and yet these students are just struggling to really perform here, that can send a message. And that might be a particular area or a particular high school or a particular district where that district is just struggling to prepare people for college. And so that's what we'll look for as trends. But
Hmm.
rarely is it a high school, it might be a district. And it typically might be a public versus a private school. And again, because we're so selective, it's not just about first year GPA. It absolutely is about retention from first to second year, but graduation over 4 years, 5 years, and 6 years. And most of our low income first gen students graduate similar or equal or sometimes higher rates than the general population. So we look at the retention retention and graduation rates. And then in the CAR committee, we do look for patterns across schools, and we have seen them rarely, but it tends to be large public districts, but very rarely. And so we keep an eye on it. So it's not that we don't admit students, but if we're going to admit a student from that school, we want to make sure that they've received the appropriate support, that the degree is worth what they say it was at the time of admission.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Jim, it may be true that a lot of people haven't heard of Swarthmore, but that's true for really any liberal arts colleges. You guys are not on ESPN, right? Within the small liberal arts and science world, selective admissions, Swarthmore is quite well known. And a lot of students that look at Swarthmore, I mean, certainly they're looking at the Ivies, that, Penns and the Browns and the Columbias. You guys have lots of overlap with all these places, but they also look at a lot of other small liberal arts schools like the Pomonas, the Williams, the Amhersts, schools like that. How would you say Swarthmore is different from Pomona, Amherst, and Williams?
No, great question. And I appreciate it because I don't know if you know, but there's a group called sixcolleges.org. Your listeners can look it up. And it is Amherst, Bowdoin, Carleton, Pomona, Swarthmore, and Williams. And we are typical competitors, but we have band together. And we did it actually right before COVID, and then actually created the URL that you see there. I think it was like, a whopping $48, and we split it 6 ways.
Good money. $8 each.
Each we could afford that during COVID, right? So no one was traveling, and we started this group, and it's been wonderful. So the idea is that we have a lot in common in terms of what we promote and what I talked earlier about the liberal arts a little bit. We may explore that more as we move through this, but I'm going to say a lot. Why we band together is what we have in common: that commitment to the liberal arts, learning for life, becoming lifelong learners. But there are differences. So Amherst and Williams, Western Massachusetts. Pomona is part of the 5 College Consortium, which is awesome, in Claremont, not LA, 45 minutes inland from LA. And so Pomona has that consortium with Claremont McKenna, Pitzer, Scripps, Harvey Mudd, and Pomona being the original and the largest college. So their location is fantastic. And again, all locations are fantastic, just different. We're located just outside of Philadelphia, as I mentioned, founded by the Quakers. Amherst and Williams are rivals in terms of athletics. We have that rivalry with Haverford. So Swarthmore is also part of a consortium where we share classes with Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore. And all three of those small schools also share classes with UPenn. And the train on campus takes you right to UPenn, which is excellent. I failed to mention this, but we gave every student SEPTA key passes. So unlimited rides on SEPTA, which is phenomenal. And this year, kudos to Bryn Mawr, they also offered SEPTA passes to their students. So the consortial agreements are a little bit different. Williams has the tutorial program. Amherst has the open curriculum. Swarthmore has the honors program, which I didn't talk about, but it's a series of seminars / preparations that you take over the course of junior and senior year. But then we invite outside examiners who've never met you, who've never taught you, and they will give you a written exam based just on the syllabus that they receive from the faculty member. And that's pretty rigorous. And we've been doing that over 100 years. And Williams tutorials are also based on Oxford, but it's 2 students with a faculty member. So all really strong in terms of how they engage with the liberal arts. And again, something I failed to mention about Swarthmore is pass-fail first semester. So no grades. Listen up, students and parents, no grades first semester. So everyone says it's about the learning, which I think is true, but I ask families to ask, how do they put that into practice? So no grades first semester and no GPA. And I think we're the only school in the United States without an official GPA. Now you have to convert your letter grades A, B, C, D to a 4.0 scale for graduate school placement, which we can help you with at the registrar's office. But it really pulls off the external pressures to, quote, compete, because you're really competing with yourself. It's not that grades aren't important, but you don't know where you stand in the class. And that is unique. I don't know another college that does that. But overall, we are all similar. Carleton, Northfield, Minnesota, Bowdoin, shout out to them. Oh, and a shout out. Sorry, I'm going to give a plug to them. News today, Reed Hastings, proud Bowdoin grad, just gave $50 million to Bowdoin.
Wow.
AI and the liberal arts, right? It's not that AI is not coming, it's here. It's how are we going to deal with it ethically? And that's what all 6 of us are doing. Bowdoin just got a jump start with their graduates. So I'm not sure your listeners may know Netflix, but the co-founder of Netflix is a residential liberal arts graduate from Bowdoin College. So shout out to Bowdoin today.
Yeah, he's become quite the educational philanthropist. I'm here in Atlanta, and he gave like around 120 million, recently to Morehouse, Spelman, and United Negro College Fund. And so, yeah, he's becoming quite the educational philanthropist. Good for Reed and good for Bowdoin. So I was going to ask this question this way. Here's some common perceptions out there about Swarthmore. Do you feel they're fair or not? But I'll be honest. These are perceptions that I have. I'll be really honest. And I want you to tell me if you feel they're fair or not, Jim. So
Sure.
First is academically intense.
Great question. And I would say academically rigorous, slight difference. So not untrue, but again, we put it on the page, right? The willingness to work hard, to seek help. Again, I didn't choose Swarthmore for the bumper sticker. Most of my friends, family, my grandmother cried because I wasn't going to UT Austin, right? Longhorn,
Sure.
Orange. She just didn't get it. So I had the experience of driving to Swarthmore with my grandmother. Actually, it was wonderful. But at the time, I just wanted to get there. She wanted to stop and see everything. But she needed to understand why I was leaving, God's country, the center of the universe, that would be Texas. And I said, I'm looking for something very different. But careful what you wish for. The rigor is there. That honors program I just talked about. But why I say rigor versus intensity is because, again, the school works hard to pull off those external pressures to, quote, compete. You're doing it because you want to be here. And so I think a lot of people not here saying, gosh, that's not what I want. But we want our students coming in eyes wide open who say, this is actually what I'm looking for. This is what isn't what I had in high school. I want to be able to double major or major minor, or be in a seminar that meets once a week for 3 to 4 to 5 hours and is dual credit versus 1 credit, because I'm doing that much reading and that much writing, and I'm really doing graduate level work at the undergraduate level. So we don't shy away from it. It's real. But again, we also don't want you to be surprised by it once you get here. It's who we're seeking, students that are really interested in that rigor.
Here's another one, quirky.
Yeah, I love this one too. Yes, we have lacrosse players who major in classics. So again, they don't come for the athletics, but we have some wonderful athletics programs, amazing basketball program, amazing men's and women's swimming, just our 4P champions. And we just finished nationals with 13 at nationals. And so they come for the academics, but then they live the full life while here. And the way I say it is, we care less what you think than that you think. And so people are curious about you because you're at Swarthmore and you might be a little bit quirky and major in circus performance. Or we had a student, again, create a major in circus studies. We had another student create a major in immigration studies. That's a really important topic today, right? We don't have that as a program. So they combined politics, economics, anthropology, sociology, and worked with the faculty to create immigration studies. So we are a little bit quirky intellectually, but we embrace that. And again, it may not be, we have athletes, but athletes who aren't all econ or business majors, but who major in the full range of liberal arts that we offer.
Here's another one: progressive politically.
Yeah, I think that's true. We welcome all voices, and that's what's different. I think people are surprised by what they get when they get here. I would argue left of center, and that's sort of been the historical founding. If you go back again to the founding, an education for men and women in the 1860s, not very common. That was a little progressive. Adding engineering in the 1880s. The first female PhD. She didn't get her PhD here because we're not a grad school, but Helen McGill White, I think it was Boston University. Her BA is at Swarthmore College. Michael Dukakis is a graduate. And so, wore the helmet in the tank. But, talks about, learning about, cutting hair on campus, but he cut the hair of non-white students who couldn't get their hair cut in the Ville. So again, learning about difference while engaging in a rigorous setting. But we also have Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, Robbie George, the leading conservative, probably academic in the country at Princeton, is a Swarthmore grad. So we welcome students from all backgrounds. And so it's again, we care less what you think than that you think, and we will push you on that. So we will ask your opinion when you're here. And so, you need to lean into the discomfort. Coming from Texas, I thought it was pretty liberal, but when I got here, I'm like, oh, I may be a little more conservative than I thought. But that was part of my education on understanding what it meant to be center, left of center, or right. And we welcome all voices.
Very diverse.
Culturally, geographically, racially, socioeconomically. One of the things that brought me here, as I said at the beginning, was the financial aid. We're not the first. Kudos to Princeton and shout out to Davidson, the first liberal arts college to go loan free, but offering loan free financial aid, meeting all determined needs. So we're not alone in that, but that allows us to bring students from backgrounds like mine. This past year, about 34% of admitted students were first generation to college. I don't know if that will, continue in perpetuity, but that's who we admitted that year. The average aid for international students is higher than it is domestically. Again, that's common among our closest peers because international students don't qualify for Pell Grants. Racially, a diverse campus, over 50% non-white, and that's even in post-SCOTUS. So again, in terms of understanding someone's lived experience and background, we've never made decisions based on a box check ever for anything. And so that commitment to really understanding the story and where the student's coming from and how they've excelled and or have the potential to succeed at an institution like this if they have the resources, then that's someone that we think would really thrive here.
And you've kind of spoken to this one already, insatiable love of learning. You can probably talk about this, Jim, but Swarthmore routinely shows up on lists of the highest percentage of students that go on to get PhDs.
Right. Yeah, I think we're third in all fields if you combine humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. And they're not all faculty. They'll be an MD, PhD, or a law degree as well as a master's or a PhD in law, and then end up teaching there or doing research or working in industry. So a lot of folks in business, we send a lot into business. But what the companies like is the skill set, sort of the critical thinking, the communication. And we're looking for that at 17. Again, it goes back to what I talked about before is less description and more analysis. And so we don't say that specifically in the instructions, but that's sort of part of the exercise. Though I'll share it if asked. You asked me and I'm sharing with your listeners. And when I go to group sessions is that we want that sense of, I don't mind if students find us on rankings, and we haven't talked about that, and I hope we don't. I mean, that's a good thing. But what I'm saying is they're not inherently bad in terms of finding a school. It's why did the school stay there? So, if you find us, then what kept it there? Was it the Quaker founding or the engineering plus the liberal arts or the honors program, or you didn't like our location? You just want to look west. So you discovered Pomona and then said, oh my gosh, they're part of 5 colleges. I can actually take science courses at Harvey Mudd and whatever at Pitzer, but also be a Pomona student. So it's what you do with that information. And we're looking for, evidence of that. And we see it in the essays. We see it in the counselor recommendations, if they have them. We also welcome community-based organization counselors to write the letters, because a lot of students don't have counselors. Those are often the first cut, and we understand that. But also we'll see that sense of love of learning in the teacher recommendations and also in the writing that the students produce.
And the last one I have here is students that want to change the world. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, we say SWATies want to leave the world a better place than they found it, in whatever regard they pursue. So, I know. Sorry, I left off the first half of that. So they tend to graduate with Swarthmore guilt. And Swarthmore guilt is wanting to leave the world a better place than you found it. So they will often find that niche. They'll either bring it or discover it here and realize the access that they have to faculty, to resources, and say, how do I make a difference while at Swarthmore and or post-graduation in my field or in my spare time. And I think that's true. And again, I don't think it's unique here, but it is something we've been committed to through the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility. So Eugene Lang is a graduate of Swarthmore, and he's the gentleman who was interviewed by 60 Minutes in the 80s. And he actually was a real life example of, well, he's not, of Michael from The Office, who promised all those students an education, right, if they graduated, but of course he couldn't do it. Gene Lang did it. He threw away the speech he was going to give and said, if you guys will just graduate from college, I will pay for it. And he did. And that was the beginning of the I Have a Dream Foundation. And now there are 200 corporations plus that sponsor Dreamers. And that was started by Gene Lang, a graduate of Swarthmore College. And then he left us the money for the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility, one of the most resourced service centers in the country that does both engaged scholarship that combines faculty with the Lang Center to help educate our students to make change, not just in the classroom, but in the real world. So it's sort of built into the model here. It's not something that we require, but the Lang Center is a center that's highly engaged by many of our students.
Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Jim Bach, Vice President and Dean of Admission at Swarthmore College. We hope you'll join us next week for the next part. On Monday's episode, I'm going to share a brand new exercise I just started doing with the students I work with. I'm really excited about. And your student can do the exact same exercise. You do not need to be working with somebody to do this exercise. I'll explain why I feel this exercise is so important, and I'll share examples of the insights this exercise can give your student into the colleges they are applying to. And then we will have part 3 of Lisa's excellent interview with Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop, authors of the best-selling book, The Disengaged Teen. And by the way, the subtitle of The Disengaged Teen is this: Helping Kids Learn Better, Feel Better, and Live Better. Now that's important. And friends, remember, your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. Or in other words, just how high you will soar in your career or in your life is going to be determined more by your attitude than your aptitude. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. Big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you will get every single episode as soon as they are released. If you want to support our podcast, you can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can say positive things about your college-bound kid on your social media feed. And you can help us stay commercial-free and pay our staff by donating on the yourcollegeboundkid website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. And if you have a question or a recommendation, just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK, hit the orange button, and speak. We will do our best to get your question in your own voice on an upcoming episode. I am the producer of the podcast, and I live in Metro Atlanta. We have a fantastic team that has over 200 years of admissions and counseling experience. Shout out to our co-hosts, Dr. Lisa Ruff in North Carolina, Susan Tree in Pennsylvania, Vince Garcia in California, Julia Escobar in Massachusetts, Linda Depker in Missouri, Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, New London, Connecticut, Hillary Dickman, an Admission Officer at Colorado College in Colorado Springs.
and our international admissions expert, Kevin Newton in Dallas, Texas. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Matvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs from Kimberly Bloss. Our reliable webmaster is Stalionis Dimitru. Website updates are done by Joyce Stucker. Our image editor is Vlad Honchar. If you want to have a coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you want to reach someone else on our team, all of our bios with contact info can be found at yourcollegeboundkid.com under the About YCBK tab. If you want to get our free monthly YCBK newsletter, YCBK Plus, it is also under the About YCBK tab. If you want to see our recommended books and websites, they are on our website under the Resources tab. While you're on our website, check out our hundreds of interviews in their entirety. Check out our college spotlights, our blog, and our upcoming events. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting with you every single Monday and every single Thursday.